I'm happy to present. Today is Dr. Sushmita Subedi, and she is from Advancing Evidence, Improving Lives from AIR. And she is going to do something a little bit different than what we've had for the previous session. She's going to be engaged in a workshop. And her primary focus is on K through 12 education. She has even brought some data that is specific to our area. So let's have a round of applause for Dr. Subedi. And you can read her full bio on our website and a brief bio in our program. So,
Thank you. Thank you, Gwen. I really appreciate it, and it's wonderful to see everyone. Welcome. And I must say, I've had a blast learning so much about the different aspects of the impacts of the pandemic today. I've been taking notes, and my notes are running so long because it's been fantastic. So Gwen, thank you for inviting me again. So what I will do, as you know, this is a workshop, and we have a nice, cozy group here. What I will do is I will start with a brief reflection question. There you go. I'll introduce myself first, of course. We'll start with a brief reflection question. I want to engage as many people as possible. I know it's kind of in the afternoon, right before the keynote. We have to move places after this, so I want to make sure that I'm getting as much interaction and learning as possible before we head out to the dinner and keynote. Does that sound good to everybody? All right, great. So what I will do is, I know this is a short session, I'll share snapshots of COVID-19 and K-12 education across the United States. And I'm saying snapshots because I won't do justice to the disaggregated data. We probably don't have the time to dive into so many of the different aspects that we can touch on, but I hope what I present will provide an overview of what happened to K-12 education system during the pandemic. So that will be my focus. And then I'll move to examples of what's happening in the field, like solutions. What are people doing at the federal level, at the states, at the schools and districts and I'll share examples from the American Institutes of Research because that's where I work at right now. There are a few examples of projects that are focusing on cross-sector collaboration. So I will present examples, and again, I hope this will be as much of a learning session for me as it will be for you. And I'm learning a lot as I go about the pandemic and K-12 education, even though I've been in it for every single day of my life over the last 2.5 years. So like I said, I am Sushmita Subedi. I'm a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research. And I'll be presenting on COVID-19 and K-12 education. So to get us started, I have a little bit of a reflection. So I would like for everyone to take 2 minutes-ish to just reflect on your role in the K-12 education system as you could be a student. I don't think there are any high school students here, but student, parent, teacher, school administrator, school staff, district administrator or staff, parent, or even a community member that was directly or indirectly engaged in the education system. And as you do so, I would like to hear from a few folks here about what stood out, right? What stood out as the most significant change that you observed in your schools or districts since the beginning of the pandemic? Oh, I see someone here. Right, go ahead.
One thing that I noticed with my nephew was that before the pandemic, I could go to daycare, I could bring cupcakes or like read close friendships that didn't make it. That was the biggest change, I think.
Great. Thank you for sharing. Others? Go ahead.
I think I have two observations. So as a parent, I would say, and I felt like I had two kids in middle school. I had two kids, and I felt like going from middle school to college, instead of having this very structured journey, they now are sort of learning about their own once a day and having to be responsible for their homework, etc. In a way, that's a great because they became more autonomous, I think, but it also changes how they learn because I think now they still think of doing assignments on their time in their way rather than like doing it by the end of the school day. Like,
Okay.
they still they act like college students. Doesn't mean they don't want to do it.
Ah, okay. Thank you for sharing that. Please, go ahead.
As a parent, and as the board said for the local school district and Dr. Loparo, I've seen for my son when he was in high school, much of the pandemic, there was a new discomfort on the part of the district to share information about health that could be useful to staff and families. And, influenced by politics and a lot of targeting of staff and nurses. And as my job is managing public communications for the school district for the last 6 months, and I think that there's a lot of ignorance and lack of knowledge about when information is protected, what kinds of data can become public, and what our responsibilities are.
Thank you for sharing. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've noticed that mental health became a significant priority that adults were really choosing to value for the first time. I think there was a sense that suddenly it was more important for us to understand how to support a whole child rather than finding just intervention aspects.
Great. Thank you for sharing. And that is one of the key sort of supports that we're seeing. Oh, sure. Go ahead. Go ahead.
One of the things which I have noticed is some of the retired teachers, they were pulled back to come back and teach because one of the things I know is some of my students, they go teach for America, whatever, for a year or two. And some of them, not in Vermont, but in other states, frankly, they were kind of offered to stay back, even though they don't have the certification to teach.
Oh,
So
okay.
I'm not saying that they're relaxing whatever rules and regulations, but at the end of the day, I don't know whether it's good set. But at least, especially the retired faculty coming back, in my view, it would be a good thing, at least they got on board.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. And all those sharings, and I'm going to come to you in just a second, they touch on the priorities that are sort of emerging for the federal government and states and schools and districts. And I will touch on some of that as I go, but I want to hear more.
I'd just like to emphasize what this gentleman said. There's been an uptick in suicide rates among 8 to 12 children as young as 5 that are harming themselves or attempting suicide. And that's one of the things, especially in the African American community, we've noticed is that there's been a huge increase in suicide.
Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else? Oh, I see a hand up over there. Sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you. Agree. Go ahead. 2 more and then we'll move on. great about that, and thank you everyone for sharing. I wonder how many of the people that shared are from this area, North Carolina. Okay. All right, I see some hands up. I asked that because the examples that you shared, the one's most significant change or issue that stood out for you is common across the United States as we look at data and voices from the communities across. And it's, as researchers and evaluators at American Institutes for Research, it's painful first to continue to see data and voices that, still they're urging policymakers and practitioners to focus on addressing the needs that are emerging and that go way back, like before the pandemic. So, it's not just regional, it's prevalent everywhere, the issues that you talked about, staffing shortages, mental health issues in students, uptake in suicide rates. That was something that someone brought up. Isolation, feelings of isolation, anxiety, depression among students and staff. So I will share snapshots. Again, I say this because I know the data I present right now won't do full justice to what's going on with the scale of the pandemic, but I hope that this will bring everyone in this room along the same lines of what's happening overall, right? So I start with a snapshot around the community. And as you have heard since this morning about disparities with Latino and Black households, around health, around economic issues, around employment, right? So education is not different in that way, in that we are seeing the effects of Latino and Black households with children. They are experiencing more hardships, 3 or more hardships at twice the rate of Asian and white child households, and that's across the United States. This was data from 2020, but I doubt it has changed a lot over the last 2.5 years. And in terms of the education system, and these are just 3 different buckets that have stood out in federal surveys. I take some of this data from the School Pulse panel, and it's, as some of you mentioned here, staffing shortages have been widely felt across the nation, and you can see the first bullet under staffing. 53% of public schools reported feeling understaffed entering this school year. And that's 2.5 years after the pandemic began, right? So we're all feeling the hate, we're all feeling the issues pop up, but what are the solutions, right? So I'll dive into some of that later on, but just providing some snapshots around the digital divide, technology. As you can see, there is a comparison in 2020 and 2021. The digital divide still exists. It's almost like at the surface, if you don't disaggregate the data, if you read the reports around digital divide in education right now, it's almost like the gap has closed. But if you disaggregate, right, by income, by students of color, by race and ethnicity, you see the disparities exist. They haven't got narrowed down as much as anybody would have liked. And it's disparate especially for children of color from low-income households. As you can see from the second bullet under technology here, 1 in 4 8 to 18-year-old students in low-income households, especially those who are children of color, still didn't have a computer or a laptop at home in 2021. So just think about how far we've come with virtual learning, remote learning, hybrid learning, and now back to school for most people. We've taken strides at figuring out solutions, but we're still not there yet. And in terms of community partnerships, 45% of public schools reported that they use a community school or a wraparound services model. Usually what that means, some of you might understand the model, but usually what that means is the school is working with community partners to support the needs of its students across the district or in portions of schools within a district. And that was much more prevalent in high poverty locations. That was also one of the findings from the School Pulse panel. Now, thinking about some of the mental health issues that were raised earlier, with the beginning of the pandemic and onset of the pandemic, and when everything went digital, and children were isolated, couldn't go to schools with remote learning, there was a significant increase in the percentage of students seeking mental health supports. And schools, you see the disparity here in terms of students needing supports and schools agreeing that they could provide mental health services to students in need. So that's another key statistic that still holds true 2.5 years after the pandemic. Now, touching on another bucket that's really important, and I put this around the last of this section because it's what's happening with the community, with the education system, and around mental and emotional supports that students need, in my opinion, tops student learning at this moment because of the scale of the pandemic itself, right? What happened with the pandemic and how we transitioned into remote learning was a major shift like we've never seen, at least in my lifetime. I haven't seen that. So, just thinking about that, but still, like assessments that are used nationwide or in a representative sample of students, they give us a picture. I have my reservations around assessments, student assessments, especially during the pandemic, but they're meaningful in their own ways because they are one key indicator that drives resources and supports and priorities across the nation. So if you just look at the learning lag, and by learning lag, what it is, how it is defined in the literature is the learning that would have happened if it were not for the pandemic. That's the typical learning. And the learning that's happening during the pandemic. So this gap right here is the learning lag. And you can see that students are 3 months behind in math and 2 months behind in reading from where they typically would be. And especially students in high poverty schools that stayed remote in the fall of 2021, they lost the equivalent of about 5.5 months of learning. That's a stark statistic that we still have to bear with. And now thinking about moving a little bit further from K-12 education to what are the post-secondary plans, how are the statistics looking like there. Youth Truth just put out a report very recently that they surveyed high school seniors and found that 1 in 4 high school seniors in the class of 2022, they have changed their post-secondary plans since the start of the pandemic. and especially the students of color, they're seeming less likely to want to go to college compared to the same student groups in the class of 2019. So, I'm sharing just snapshots of these statistics. There is a lot of nuance to this, and I'm happy to talk after this, or feel free to reach out to me anytime. It's always, I'm always up for a conversation around these because they're tough issues, they're big issues, and there's a lot of debate going on around this. So I will pause for 1 minute and have everyone read the quote by our current Secretary of Education. This was shared by the Secretary in a recent event last month. So, this is the statistics we've looked at so far. It resonates with this quote, and one of the things that I've learned through this morning is, statistics are scary at this point. They're painful, especially for teachers and educators and staff and parents and community members who are, feeling the direct heat of the pandemic in their day-to-day lives. It's hard for researchers and evaluators and other members in the community to continue to grapple with these issues, but not finding the solutions that work for everybody. There's no one size fits all, but there's still a long way to go in figuring out what works and what doesn't. So with that, I do want to focus a little bit more on promising practices and solutions. I know it's been a long day. I don't want to end on a sad note. I want to make sure that we understand and acknowledge that there are things happening at scale and in individual, like school district or community level, that's driving student success, that's driving students, like providing students with the supports that they need. It's not all dreadful and dreary. So I want us to focus on that. So in the next section, I want to start by asking everyone present here, what promising programs and practices have you seen implemented in your state or your school or your district or your kids or your friends' schools or districts that have been addressing issues in teaching and learning and the overall education system this year, or you could talk about last school year as well. I want to learn more from you. Go ahead. No, okay. And sure. Could we provide a microphone over here, please? Yeah. Sorry about that. I had a question, follow-up question to you as well. So she was sharing about how Virginia, some of the schools in Virginia, they were providing services to special education students. Could you repeat so everybody can hear?
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
So implementing some provisions within IEPs became really challenging in the early stages of the pandemic when everything was removed to more of a remote format. because no one was sure how to adapt those services in a way that would still protect students that were vulnerable, and also how to sort of dispatch them in a way that didn't add additional burden to those providers or that seemed reasonable within the current infrastructure. And so some school districts, probably a little bit higher resource to be honest, started dispatching those therapists to individual students' homes so that they were still able to receive those services, particularly for students that had more time-sensitive or severe developmental disabilities, like autism, just because even a few months or a year for those students, that can be a really significant difference in their entire educational trajectory. And so assuring that even within the chaos and the difficulty of that period, that those students were still able to sort of learn and at least make some progress, I think made a big difference for a lot of families. Because a lot of what I saw and the anxieties that I saw in some parents during that time were, particularly since the education system still didn't serve those students as well as it could have, feeling like their children were going to get left even more behind, or that they weren't going to be able to meet the same goals or whatever it may be that they'd planned out in the beginning of the year or at the beginning of their educational trajectory.
Over there, and then.
One of the things, I'm a professor in the program in education here at Duke, and one of the things that we're really looking at is the teachers' health and well-being. We already have a big issue with teacher attrition before the pandemic, and I think the pandemic really exacerbated that. We're trying to figure out through a research grant the reasons why teachers left the classroom during the pandemic, and were those reasons different than the reasons that they were leaving prior. And we also have a living and learning community called Duke Teach House, where we have teachers that are early career teachers in Durham Public Schools that live together, and there's a lot of programming around that program in terms of with a real focus on teacher health and well-being, because it's kind of like, you know, when you fly and they tell you to put your mask on before assisting others. Mm-hmm. If we want teachers to be able to help students through some of these social emotional challenges that they're going to have, they have to be sound as well. And so I think we would be remiss if we didn't also think about the impact that this has had on teachers. And that very first question you had up there about what changes I saw that I found fascinating or what have you, and that's the change that happened, that teachers and school systems pivoted immediately. Mm-hmm. And the fact that we can turn on a dime and change the paradigm or change what we're doing to a completely new structure in that short amount of time, I think was really remarkable. Mm-hmm. And I think it speaks to the fact that we can change, and change sometimes doesn't have to take years, mm-hmm. right?
Absolutely. Could I ask you a quick follow-up question on
Sure.
that? I'm curious though, what were the systems and infrastructures that were in place for this particular group that the pivot that you talked about, mm-hmm. what made it possible?
I think that what made it possible is the commitment of the teachers to their students and to the families that they serve. I mean, a genuine love and caring. They were concerned about their children not being able to see them, their students, every day. They were concerned, like this gentleman was talking about, if they were getting, if they weren't coming to school, were they getting the food that they needed? So I think just that compassion and that empathy is what drove it. And in Durham Public Schools is remarkable. They gave teachers what they needed to make that pivot possible. And they came up with creative ideas and solutions, and not every one of them worked perfectly the first time, but they were flexible and they made modifications, and it worked. I mean, it wasn't ideal, of course, but it was better than just sitting around and not doing anything. So.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. There was a hand up.
Hi, my name is Tim Diet. So I happen to be chair of the school board of my local district, and I'll admit that I'm it's not really anything that I did at all, but quite proud that our district was the one school district in the state of Virginia that increased test scores between 2019 and 2021. One promising program, I mean, I'll just echo, I mean, it was all the teachers. We had other advantages of why, so that's why I wouldn't want to claim any credit, but it really was the teachers that made it happen. And I do think there's a greater confidence now in experimentation and trying out new things. They've definitely kept some of the practices. One of the practices, in response to the gentleman's comment about mental health, that I have appreciated, I'm also a parent, and my kids have talked about, is carving out intentional time each week for social emotional learning, so that they, as a district, they got together and talked about that. They carved out topics for across grades to progress through, and have come up with a really, I think, great plan. So the teachers talking about it with each other, and then having time to talk about that with the students, I think, has been one beneficial practice.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing. Go ahead. Over there. Oh, right there.
Yeah, well, I'll just kind of piggyback on what you said. I mean, I think the biggest answer to this is, well, why don't you ask students, right? Why don't you ask us what we think? Why don't you put us in positions to where we can actually be decision makers and have a role in this system? I think what I've seen, right, as the student myself, I just talked a lot about mental health and mental health services. We seem to be picking up on that, right? Talking about more engaging content and finding ways to pull students in for things that actually genuinely interest them. And I know it's crazy, but the easiest way to understand what genuinely interests a student is by asking a student what genuinely interests them. And maybe that also means that our concept of adults being the ultimate measure of authority is probably not what makes sense, right? We talk about our country being a democratic system, and yet our most undemocratic institution is the education system. You want me to vote, and yet I have absolutely no say in anyone that serves on my school board? It doesn't make a lot of sense. I served as a member of my school board in high school, and what I found in that role as a student and a board member was the idea that when you put students in a position to where they can actively make a difference and they feel seen and heard, suddenly the conversation changes, and suddenly they know that they matter so much that they're more open to learning, to understanding, and to growing.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing. Oh, one over there and then.
Sandra Trejos again, Professor of Economics, Pennsylvania Western University. Western rural Pennsylvania. So in Western rural Pennsylvania, with the pandemic, we realized many of these kids, and I'm speaking as a mother of senior high school then, or junior high school, our youngest daughter, but learning and hearing and from other parents and so on, that many of them had no access to either the internet or devices. So I know the question is more like, it seems that it's more institutionalized, but also the schools and parents like me realized my daughter may be with peers who have no access to things we take for granted, even though we live in the same location, kind of. But some people are even more remote, or it has to do with income or any other factors that I can think of. That's something that the technological aspect that may have made schools be more intentional about how to complement this in the teaching learning process. And another factor that I was thinking of when I hear about the teacher's effect, I cannot not think of the parents' effect. With all respect to the teachers, and I'm a teacher, right? Because there was greater presence of parents at home. They were forced to be at home, and as a mother, I know that being at home, you may be more accessible to questions your kids may have. I know for some other kids, maybe actually the parents were more out of the house, nurses, right? So it could be in the negative front or in the positive fronts, the parents' effect, and we should see which one dominates. But there is definitely, I want to think that some of the kids did better, because of having parents at home who were helping with the teaching process as well, more so than before the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing. Oh, there was one hand up. I'll do that.
Good evening. I am Yamel Anderson Ruff, and I work with Durham Public Schools. Some of the things that we have implemented this year to support all of our stakeholders, we've adopted an SEL curriculum K-12 to support social emotional learning. And we also do include student voice. We've incorporated utilizing the Panorama data systems and how we are going to launch that consistently. We're working on how we'll utilize that data from our students to support their well-being and their academics. For teachers to support our students in terms of academics, we've done an MTSS reboot and really trying to help our teachers through that MTSS model and getting back into utilizing that for our student needs. We've also done a reboot of our PLCs, right? Our professional learning communities, student data talks, how we are utilizing data to support our students at all levels and across demographics. And then we have our COVID Keeps, really trying to support parents. What we found is that having virtual options for our parents really helps them sometimes to be more engaged. We get more participation that way because I can take a break at work and still get this information, right? So finding the things that we keep and utilizing that increased technology that we got to make sure we stay engaged with our families. Also doing that for opportunities for our teachers, right? So that they can still be with their families and expand their knowledge base.
Great, thank you for sharing. One more and we'll have to move forward.
I think one of the things that we take away from COVID, one of the positive, I have to agree, is the parent engagement and the self-sufficiency that parents gained from COVID, so much so that the framework became more of a community education for Black people, that parents and children were learning at the same time about social justice, about the Black experience in America. So much so that states have banned the teaching of the Black experience in schools. And so if they've banned it, these test scores that we look at, do they test how much Black students know about their Black history? And if those scores are decreasing, or are they increasing? So did a Black child before COVID know Black history? And did they know after COVID? Would those test scores be higher? We don't know because they weren't tested about Black history. Okay, so the whole framework changed because parents realized they didn't know Tulsa, Oklahoma happened. And students didn't either. So Black adults learned as students. They became students. And Black parents became students, and they learned along with their children. And I say this as a Black homeschooler before COVID. And when COVID happened, people came to me. How do you do it? What do your kids learn? How are their test scores? And I say, I don't teach on their framework because then my kids will have low self-esteem, some of these mental health issues that came out during COVID. Well, my kids didn't have it because they believed in themselves. They knew exactly what they were watching on TV. It was not new. They knew about the Asian bans that had happened in America because I taught them. And I was able to. I didn't have to get voted in or out. So the framework of public schooling has got to change. And like the quote you had before, were we doing our children justice in the public school system with having 85 to 80% of them being children of color, or 90, and then the teachers not having the Black experience and feeling uncomfortable teaching the Black experience, or the Asian experience, or the Latino experience about migration, and even having the knowledge or the want to learn or teach something other than a national history. And now I'm coming from, as a historian, as a student of Dr. Trotter, who spoke earlier about the Black experience. So I just think about the self-sufficiency, so much so that the Black experience has been banned from being taught by Michigan and Florida, for example. You can't teach about some of the things we learned here today. And so if our kids were here today, they may have learned a little bit about the Asian experience, the Asian American experience, which has been banned. And I keep repeating that because we can pat ourselves on the back and say what we did and the test scores might be higher or lower, but what are we actually testing? What the mental health issues were there before, and they came out and people had to acknowledge. And as far as the question before about what I noticed in my school district, although I'm a homeschooler, is that they used the mental health issues to form a police department within the school. They used it. They said it was dangerous. Schools were more dangerous after COVID, so now the school system has a police department within the school system.
Just a quick question. I may have missed this. Which school system?
This is in Western Pennsylvania, a Western Pennsylvania school system. So I can tell you the exact one afterwards, but they have went ahead and voted to have a police department to use the COVID money that came from that was passed with the Texas shooting. With the mental health, and they, instead of using it for mental health, it got pushed to, well, we have to protect ourselves from the mental health trauma and issues.
Thank you for sharing, and everyone, thank you for sharing. With respect to time, I do want to move on, but what I'm hearing from this room is it's about the system. It's about a combination of things that happens or does not happen that results in what happens to our students and to our teachers and to our schools. And that is what I am seeing. And I don't know it all. I learned a lot from everyone here about the different school systems. I am based in Massachusetts, and I'm going to share a little bit about some of the programs and policies that have emerged from Massachusetts, but then I open the floor again to learn more from your specific states or districts. But to get started with, I'm trying to help us understand how things are functioning at the federal, state, and then cross-sector collaborations. I framed the next section in that way. I'll start with the federal priorities, right? So as the pandemic happened, and we've touched on all 4 of these priorities in our examples, in the most significant changes or issues that you saw in your school districts or states, and in sharing about the prominent practices or promising practices in your school districts or states, right? We've talked about physical and mental health for students, school personnel, families. We've talked about supports for educator and staff, stability and well-being. We've talked a little bit about how we're accelerating academic achievement among students by supporting other needs that have surfaced during the pandemic. So, these are the priorities that have been developed by the federal government, and the investments have been huge. I'd say it's still not sufficient, but it's a move in a justified direction based on what we are seeing as outcomes of the pandemic, as impacts of the pandemic, right? And examples from some states. I only present 3 here. I know there's a group from North Carolina here, so I wanted to share about, my highlights might have changed, but I'll tell you what the blue, the empty boxes are. The Promising Practices Clearinghouse from North Carolina is something that stood out as I was researching about what is happening in the field, what is happening in states, and how states are tackling and how states are trying to figure out solutions to these complex issues that, like it shared earlier, it's a combination of things. It's the system that needs fixing. It's not like student outcomes, or it's not teacher shortages. It's not just the technology, right? It's a combination of things. So at the state level, North Carolina has created this clearinghouse of best practices that anybody can access. And I thought that was, it's accessible, it's reasonable, people are able to share their own school or district's practices by going online. So it's inclusive, and I thought that was a big step towards from this state, right? From what we could be doing to collaborate and communicate about promising practices. Another example I share is from Massachusetts. So when the pandemic happened, leaders and school districts and teachers and students all across Massachusetts, there was a big debate and conversation that led to this document of sorts called Accelerated Roadmap. And it's a big document. It's hundreds of pages. There are two versions. One is for educators, one's for school leaders, but it provides guidance based on what's happening in Massachusetts, like what could be alternative approaches, phased approaches to this new academic year or years moving forward. How can educators and school leaders think about what's going on externally that might be affecting and throughout the state that might be affecting their individual schools, where to get supports, how to make sure students are meeting the standards that were set. So it's a combination of evidence-based information that is available to students, that's available to educators and school leaders across Massachusetts. So I thought that was another important example to share. And then Michigan has something similar. It's equity-driven, evidence-focused. It's a multi-year sort of recovery plan. It's called the Blueprint for Student Success. I'm forgetting because my highlights are in blue right now and I can't see them. But it's called the Blueprint, and it's a comprehensive plan that sort of provides guidance to local education leaders in developing and implementing in their individual schools and districts what could be specific to address the needs of their schools and districts. So I thought that was another big example, and I can share the links to this later on. And then I trained as a systems researcher and evaluator. And I always think of like cross-sector collaboration as key to solving the complex issues that face education right now. And I bring examples. These are, this is my wheelhouse. These are all projects that I'm involved in some ways at AIR. And just sharing these to make everyone aware of there are different levels too. The Pre-K-12 Restart Network is a federal grant that is supporting this network of research teams across the United States that just launched in September. It's essentially, how do we conduct research in partnership with state and local education agencies to improve learner engagement, re-engagement, and achievement? So it's, right now there are 4 teams from California, from Illinois, from North Carolina, actually, the one that was added very recently. And AIR is the network lead for this network. And what we're trying to do is build infrastructures and systems that then allow the research teams to not just provide solutions to the states and LEAs that they're working with, but also to learn and engage and share with each other and from each other, right? And at a very rapid pace too. So the plan is to meet every 3 months, either virtually or in person, bring practitioners twice a year and policymakers so they are aware of what's going on in the field. And just share out knowledge. That is basically the focus of this network. And this is something that is happening as we go. There might be more teams from other states added to the network. But this is the kind of important work that this is just one example, right? That's happening across sectors. And sometimes it's a combination of sectors that come together to inform education, K-12 education. The other project that I'm involved in that I thought would be a great example here is the COVID-19 and equity in education. We call it CEE. What we're trying to do is, again, data is key. Research practice partnerships are key. Building in community voices is key, right? What are the stories that we're hearing from communities that are very significantly affected by the pandemic, and how does that relate to the data that's being collected by the state or the school district? So how can we combine all of those different layers at the state level, then at the community level? By community, I mean school district level, and individuals within the community. They could be teachers, they could be students, so we're collecting data from students, teachers, school and district staff and leaders, community members, or representatives of community-based organizations that might be working with school districts, just to make sure that all these voices and data are presented in a coherent manner so that we're learning not just about one particular aspect or layer of the education system, but one thing is informing another. So it's a sort of a big undertaking, but it's challenging nonetheless. Building a network of research practice partnerships is challenging at this point. We just had our first in-person convening. We started in 2020, November of 2020, and we had our first in-person convening earlier this month. So just getting people together is a challenge right now, right? But the goal is like, how do we create networks? How do we create systems? How do we create conversations that flow over time and build on each other to inform policies across states and districts? So that is one of the goals. The other two, and I know we don't have much time, we're a little bit over time. These are also examples of collaborative efforts that came out of the pandemic that are now informing at different levels. How can we make sure that our students are, first, their needs are taken care of, and second, how can we make sure within the given constraints of the education system right now, how are we able to provide the best possible solutions so our students can thrive? And I can share links. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'll share my email with everybody. But these are the kinds of examples that give me hope personally. And these are just the projects that I'm involved in. And I know each and every one of us here is engaged in this kind of activity in one or the other way, right? Because we care about, we care. That is the key and bottom line to it. And I just wanted to end with these. I know this is not enough, and 1 hour isn't enough to just share and learn from each other about what's going on, but this is a start. So I wanted to end today, before we head to the dinner, with some bright spots that we're seeing. And thank you everyone for participating. I am open to any questions and happy to engage.
Thank you. I apologize for missing the first part. The statistics that you gave us, is that national or just one location?
Those are mostly nationally representative samples. So some of the statistics I pulled from the School Pulse panel. It's the,
Can't hear you.
oh, is it better now? Thank you. Is it better? All right. So some of the statistics I pulled from were from the School Pulse panel. That is a survey of 800 to 850 schools that are a nationally representative sample. The Youth Truth Survey is, I believe it has more than 200,000 participants across the country. So I tried to pull from nationally represented. Some of them are weighted samples, but nonetheless, they're not specific to any regions. Sure. Other questions? All right. Thank you very much.